Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Very happy to be joined today by Daron Shaw, professor of government at the University of Texas at Austin.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here, Daron, and he's also founding co-director of this polling project, poll number 52 in the books, brother.
Man. Yeah.
And Joshua Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project, there for most of the 52.
Yeah.
Lion's share. I don't know what the technical definition of lion's share is.
Taking 52 worth of heat, I know that.
Yeah, lion's share I think is to be 2/3 plus one. Anyway.
I'll bet that's pretty close. So Daron's back not just because we like him, but because we want to talk about the poll, the UT Texas Politics Project poll that we released early Friday morning to the usual hosannas. The poll included our regular move to a likely voter screen, which we talked about a lot last time Daron was here, actually. And we found Governor Abbott leading by double digits, 54-43, double-digit leads down ballot in the statewide races we polled. We'll talk about this. It drew attention Friday and over the weekend because it's a bigger lead than as of Friday we'd seen, as most of the polling in Texas has switched to using likely voter screens. And again, we talked about the reasoning and the procedure for filtering our overall sampling to get a likely voter pool right after our last poll in the context of explaining why we hadn't done it last time. So we don't necessarily need to revisit all that. And Josh, you did a great piece on the blog a few weeks ago that I'll refer our listeners to on likely voters. You can find it on the blog site at the blog section of the site at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So let's jump into it. Josh, why don't you start us off by just running down quickly the likely voter screen we used and then the margins that we found among those likely voters in the statewide races.
Sure. So, the likely voter screen that we settled on this time, which is based on the likely voter screens that we've used in the past mostly, relied on equal balance of what voters tell us that they've done in the past and what they intend to do in this coming election. So essentially, a likely voter in this poll was among our 1,200 self-declared registered voters, those respondents who said that they either vote in every election looking back over the last few years, so they're consistent voters, they see themselves that way, or looking ahead to this upcoming election on a scale of 0 to 10, sort of rating their likelihood to vote, with 10 being absolutely certain, 0 being, never, right? And we basically said if you were a 9 or a 10, we included you in likely voter sample. That resulted in 883 likely voters, which produces a margin of error for the full sample of likely voters of plus or minus 3.3%. Okay.
So, and just, a quick point about that. And this is like where Daron makes fun of me because I used to read the comments on the blogs. For those of you on Twitter that didn't read the methodological section because you were seeing red too much, you'll notice that's both has a retrospective component in terms of what people report having done in the past and a prospective component that is their thoughts about what they're going to do. So this was not based simply on what people have done in the past.
Right. Thank you. Okay. So what do we find? What do we find overall? So just running through the top races we measured here. As you already said, Jim, we found Greg Abbott leading Beto O'Rourke 54-43, so an 11-point margin overall. It's a little bit farther than he's been in kind of most statewide polling, where it's been around 7-8 points in that kind of range. And in fact, just as real quick, we talked about this last week. If you just look at the result among just registered voters, the gap's about 7 points. So as we go and we tighten that screen and we look at a little bit, again, I think an older, more consistent electorate, as usual, it tends to accrue to a Republican advantage. We can talk a little bit more about that. Looking at the lieutenant governor's race, we see Dan Patrick up 51-36 over Mike Collier, so that would be a 15-point lead. For attorney general, Ken Paxton's leading Rochelle Garza 51-37, so a 14-point lead, pretty much the same. In the comptroller's race, Glenn Hager is up 47-35 on Janet Dudding, sorry, Janet.
I think.
So that's, plus 12. Now, here we would say we'll come back to this, but the fact that, the comptroller is under 50% is also largely a reflection of name recognition, that he has is a little bit lower for him than it is for some of these other candidates. For example, Agriculture Commissioner Sid Miller is up 51-39. Again, Sid Miller is pretty,
He's got the hat.
He's got the hat.
Yeah.
Among other things. In the Land Commissioner race, we saw Don Buckingham up 47-36 over Jake Clayburgh, so plus 11. And again, Dawn Buckingham, same thing, state senator. She's not going to have the same sort of statewide profile.
Yeah, one thing we should notice about that is that she's the one person in that on the Republican side who is not an incumbent, because George P. Bush resigned that seat, or it didn't run for re-election for that seat, so that he could run unsuccessfully for the AG nomination. I mean, he didn't resign to run unsuccessfully.
It just sort of happened.
Yeah.
Well,
he resigned to run, unsuccessfully as it turned out,
That's one of those, the placement of the comma matters kind of things. Okay. And just real quick, just to round it out, the congressional trial ballot among likely voters, we saw, Republicans with a +9 advantage, 53-44. For the legislature, about a +11, 53-42. So for the most part, on the statewide races are actually outperforming the trial ballot a little bit at this point. So that's the rundown on the top races.
Okay, so what do you make of this, Daron? We were talking about this going in, and I wish you could all see the little shrug Daron just gave us.
That was the alternative.
Sometimes it would be better to do this on video, but generally not.
Turn on the TikTok. Josh.
Turn on the TikToker.
Josh, thanks. Yeah, because here I am.
Yeah, I mean.
Well, let's speak to a couple of issues for skeptics. Not that anybody listening to the podcast would be skeptical, but
we like skeptics. We don't like cynics.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. With respect to the likely voter screen, one of the things that Josh pointed out in passing and saying that, where are we, like 880 or something like that? 883 are likely voters out of 1,200 registered voters. Well, those proportions are about right. You end up getting between 65 and 75% of registered voters vote in a midterm election. So the proportion of our sample, our RV sample that gets through the likely voter screen is a plausible sample. And it's a function of people who have voted in the past and, as Jim mentioned, are fired up about voting this time. It might be surprising to those who assume or have read or consumed information that you see in the national context about how the Democrats are as fired up as the Republicans about voting nationally. And I've seen enough of that data to think that's probably right. But in Texas, it's just not quite as evident. There still is an enthusiasm and engagement edge on the part of the Republicans. So to the extent that attitudes change and are subject to context and mobilization, if you're Democratic out there and you're not happy with this, well, I mean, it's always possible that, you've got a late arriving crowd, as we say. I mean, so that's, and again, that gets you from, the +11 in the Abbott-O'Rourke race down to the +7 if Democrats simply kind of, realize this is an important race and show up, right? But a couple numbers in here that are interesting, I think. So, if you were against, or saying, well, you guys have, my favorite line is, you have too many Republicans in the sample. Well, that's actually not really the problem here for the Democrats. Take a look at some of these other numbers. Now, Josh, did I read the U.S. House wrong? I thought that was 47 Republican.
That's RV.
Okay,
Sorry.
RV. Even so, the House race amongst all registered voters is 47% Republican, 45% Democrat. Right. So you look at that numbers, and the sample therefore looks, from our point of view, from sort of a professional pollster point of view, you're like, well, a +2 in the registered voter sample for the U.S. race, U.S. congressional race, is a pretty plausible number. In fact, it's, about what we've seen. It's actually maybe even a little more Democratic.
I was saying one might say that's a little Democratic.
Right. So because that's in the sample, if that number had
plausible
come
but Democratic.
Right. If that number had come back +15 Republican, we'd take a look at the sample. Oh boy. But the fact is, so there is a baseline measure there suggesting that what's happening is it's the likely voter screen plus the specific races you're talking about that seem to be favoring the Republicans right now. Towards that end, if you look at some of the sub numbers here right now, I mentioned that it's not just the composition of the sample that's hurting the Democrats. Right now, Abbott is winning amongst independent voters by a 60-29 clip. He's winning Republicans 95-3. It's not possible at this point in time for a Democrat to win a statewide election when they're picking up no Republicans and getting absolutely whacked amongst independents.
And I was going to say, I think that's also hurting them, down sample with some of these other groups. So the fact is that split with independents is sort of what you see is, this is sort of the interesting. There's been a bunch of polls released in the last few days, and there's going to be more kind of going along. And what I've noticed so far in kind of comparing the internals of all these polls is that what you tend to see is, whether you're picking up the negativity among independents or not in a lot of cases.
Right. Well, and I think the negativity among independents is diluted by the people that just do a, 3-point party ID.
3-point party ID and an RV sample.
Right. And so, we're talking about, in our sample, we're talking about 8% of true independents who will, and these are true independents who will not budge even when we nudge them a little bit in the poll.
We've made this point before, but just so the audience is kind of with us on this, we ask an initial party ID question, and quite a few people, 30 to 40%, sometimes upwards of 40%, say, I'm independent. I do not think of myself as a Republican, nor do I think of myself as a Democrat. To those individuals, we ask a second question, is, well, do you lean one way or the other? And when you do that, the 30 to 40% comes down to 10 to 15% because most independents do lean closer to one party or the other. Now, you might reasonably say, well, why don't you take them at their word and just treat them as independents? Because the leaners vote, and this is true in this sample, we looked at the internals, the leaners vote 85 to 90% for the party to which they lean. They're not really independent.
And you look at their issue positions. They're pretty clearly somewhere between the strong partisans and the somewhat partisans.
That's the thing.
And on the Republican side, they're even closer to the strong.
Well, and that's the exact thing. Even, and this is just to belabor this point, if you take the people that who originally said, no, I'm a Republican, or no, I'm a Democrat, and then we say, well, are you like a real strong Republican or, not so strong Republican or Democrat? And you look at the attitude space across, these three groups, strong Republicans or Democrats, sort of leaning Republicans or Democrats, and these people who are originally independents, and then we pulled them over and made them a partisan, if you want to think that way, they look like the strong partisans. They don't look like the weak partisans. So if anything, if there's any sort of skepticism, cynicism, reticence about it, their issue positions line up, again, more towards the strong identifiers than the weak identifiers in most cases. So this is, I was going to say an overly technical point. It's not an overly technical point. It's an important point. So when y'all look at our poll, you'll see, this poll has 35% independents and our poll has 10. That's the reason. Now, kind of relatedly, when we say Abbott's up 60 to 29 or 60 to 30 amongst independents, we're talking about, as Jim mentioned, that's 8 to 10% sliver of the electorate.
And once you run the likely voter screen, I think we are down to 8.
But if that 8% in a state like Texas, where Republicans have kind of a built-in party advantage of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 points at this point, if you can't win those independents as a Democrat, you can't close that gap. You can't get to anywhere close to where you need to go. And our poll indicates right now, and again, independents move a lot. That's something to really bear in mind here. We've got 3 weeks or more before the election, right? They can move, but right now the Democrats are just not competitive enough amongst independents to do well.
I think that's where the favorability ratings that we did for all the candidates illuminates some of that. Certainly illuminates that with O'Rourke and Abbott.
That's right.
Neither O'Rourke nor Abbott is really, independents by their nature, they don't have these partisan moorings. They don't pay that much attention.
They hear the loudest noise.
They hear the loudest noise. That's great. They're, I was going to say they soak in a very negative environment that we're in. So nobody's doing that great. But O'Rourke's numbers are very negative among this group.
That's right. And just a couple things, and then we can move to kind of that political context, But I just jotted these down. There is a gender gap. Obviously, this is again the Gov race, but it persists down ballot. Abbott currently is carrying men by 21 points, but he's about break even with women. There's a gender gap, but it doesn't take an algebra whiz to figure out if you're up 20 with half the population and you're even with the other, you're probably in pretty good shape. O'Rourke's best group, as you might imagine, as it was in 2018 against Cruz, is younger voters. Right now, with under 30, he's up 8 points. However, and this is something we've seen nationally, the Republicans are really doing well with seniors. And right now, Abbott's up 22 points with seniors. If y'all are looking at the national polls, that's something that I think has really got to be concerning to the Democrats. Biden actually carried seniors in 2020. But right now, the Democrats are hemorrhaging votes with older voters.
One of the things, and you can't do that in a midterm election, right? Because
Yeah.
when you're thinking about the seniors,
Yeah.
what you're talking about reliable voters. And what I was about to say is, I mean, the problem with independence is, it manifests in a couple points here and there, but it's also manifesting everywhere else. To the extent we've been talking about key groups in the electorate, and we've been sort of dividing them between we're talking about independents, we're talking about Hispanics, we're talking about people in the suburbs. But the thing is that, of course, you can have Hispanics in the suburbs, you can have independent Hispanics and all these things. And when you look across the numbers, these problems for O'Rourke multiply within each group.
Right.
Right?
Yep. Yeah, so this the finals, we're talking about sort of key groups. I pulled suburban voters, and Abbott's got an 11-point lead with suburban voters. And that's a lesser trend nationally, lesser in the sense that Republicans are carrying suburban voters by 3 to 5 points in most of the national polls I've seen. But here, and it's not just Texas, these are people in these suburbs who've drawn a lot of attention lately. In Houston and Dallas and even in Austin, these places are really going purple. But right now, Abbott's been able to maintain that edge.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's purple compared to 20 years ago.
Right.
I mean,
right.
But it's not that, but that change is not complete. And it still moves.
Right.
Right. And we're talking about a lot of voters.
Well, and
suburbs.
also the other thing too is, just an aside, Texas remains, the place that has the fastest growing suburbs in the country. So it's very, usually we say, well, population change is slow and all this kind of stuff, except for the fact when we're talking about these counties that are adding 50,000 people every, couple years over and over again, it's like, it still sort of is very up in the air going forward, although not this time.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that means, I got a stray thought on that that makes me, very speculatively, it does make me wonder a little bit about some of the patterns we saw, people moving more to the outer suburbs and exurbs in response to the pandemic and the working at home thing. Mm-hmm. It does make me wonder if that's maybe been a short-term fluctuation that added to this.
It's a fascinating subtopic. You're right. We could do a whole podcast on that. But the Williamson counties, the Kyle, Buda suburbs around Austin, but then you go to Fort Bend and these places, and it's the way exactly. The way the media tends to write about this is that these voters are moving back and forth. There's a little bit of that, but it's mostly compositional change.
Right.
There's just tons of people from the urban areas moving into these places, and they bring their political sensibilities with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. And so one other thing I wanted to add to this is also, I talked to one of our frequent readers, probably not a listener, earlier this morning, who was talking about those gaps down ballot too. And, one thing that is interesting is that this is why I raised the favorability ratings also a minute ago, is that, the Democratic ticket candidates below O'Rourke are really unknown to most voters. Yeah. And I think that, all along we've been assuming that we're picking up partisan balance in trial ballots like this to the extent that we've run them, certainly with the Patrick race, the Patrick Collier race, and the Paxton Garza race. But, in the Paxton Garza race, 11% of Democrats still are not committing to a candidate. Now, that either means maybe they'll drop out or maybe they'll eventually come home, and the gaps in those races will tighten. But for those that expect those races to look more competitive and to be more competitive, when you look at the fave-unfaves, half or more, and I think virtually all of those races below the gubernatorial have people don't have attitudes about the Democratic candidates.
Yeah, and this is
and the name recognition even of the incumbents is not that high for that.
Well, this is sort of as we get to this sort of we're kind of getting to a point where it says, so how and why,
right.
All this, and this is always sort of a perpetual story in Texas, right? Is that it's a big state, it's an expensive state to campaign in. And, setting aside, I think, the overall kind of national issue environment, local issue environment sort of fight for attention and how that's played out, the other side of this is that, if you're Rochelle Garza, ultimately, more than half the electorate doesn't know you. According to this poll, 42% of Democrats don't have an opinion. So when you say 11% are kind of well, I don't really know you, it's because they literally may not have any idea who these people are.
And I don't know, if you guys watched, you guys are healthier than I am. You probably didn't watch a lot of TV over the weekend, but the Paxton campaign is running an attack ad on Garza that is, all about immigration and border security, very negative. So for a lot of these people, that's going to be the first thing they see, I think, in a lot of settings. So
I think we touched on this before, but it's an interesting strategic question about should any of these Republicans even obliquely talking about their opponents.
I mean, I was thinking about this with respect to the Patrick Collier race in particular. You know, I mean, the coverage of his campaign, Patrick's that is, of the last few weeks is talking about this sort of quixotic might not be the word, but this bus tour in rural Texas where, you know, there's no schedule. No one knows where he's going to be. They're not telling the press about it. And I mean, at some point, you know, and so the first questions I was getting is like, well, you know, is he worried about the rural vote? And I said, no, I think if he was worried about the vote, he might go somewhere where there are more voters. You know, he might actually, I mean, this is not a knock. This is just a political, you know, sort of calculus. Like maybe he would want to extend himself into some places where he'd be competing for votes if he really thought in the last couple of weeks of the campaign that's what he needed to do. Yeah. But I think he's kind of cruising as an incumbent. And I mean, one thing I've pointed out on this podcast before, and I'll point it out again about both of these races in comparison then, people keep saying like, well, you know, but Paxton's under indictment. I mean, surely these legal problems. I say, he was under indictment 4 years ago. And a lot of people voted for him. And he has a very strong brand, especially with Republicans. And every time we sort of measure job approval, favorability ratings, if you look at Dan Patrick, who has no legal problems, and you look at Ken Paxton and his legal problems, attitudes towards both of them among Republicans are basically identical.
Yeah, I mean, this is the point. This is a party. The survey suggests a party line vote in Texas is about, you know, 47 to 36 right now, something like that, right? You know, if they don't really know who the Republicans are and they don't know who the Democrat is, so you know, that's not a indictment. I mean, I think
it's a little bit of an indictment because it's a reflection of the fact that nobody's really happy with anybody.
Well, maybe indictment.
Oh, that's an indictment, sir.
Yeah.
I'm just in the sense that, like, you know, part of it is if you looked underneath the hood and you said like, well, but like clearly there's a big gap, and look, different people have positive views about O'Rourke, obviously, than have positive views about Abbott, and vice versa, right? But when you look under the hood at a lot of this stuff, if the dominant storyline, like say for the Democrats, is people don't know who they are. You know, the dominant story at the top of the ticket amongst the candidates who people actually know is kind of ambivalence. And in a case of ambivalence in a bad national environment for Democrats in a state that trends Republican by at least a couple points, if not more, we are seeing what looks like we talked about this last week or 2 weeks ago, kind of a normal election here.
It's the partisan devil, you know.
Yeah.
Just a couple points. Jim sort of hinted at this. You know, in the Gov race, Abbott's at 47% approval, 44% disapprove. So he's, you know, +3, which is for a guy who's been around as long as he has in times where voters are unhappy with the state of the world.
He'll take net positive even if it's only 3.
And he's 46% favorable, 44% unfavorable. So we have a job rating and then we have a sort of more personal rating. O'Rourke's at 44% favorable, 47% unfavorable. So alone amongst Democrats, O'Rourke does not have a recognition problem. His problem is the baggage that he's accrued from the past campaigns. And the Abbott campaign has been very, I think, consistent and
relentless
smart,
might be the word.
Smart about making this bringing O'Rourke into this because people know who O'Rourke is. In these other races, there's a question of whether Republicans ought to even be talking about their opponents. But in the Gov race,
you mentioned that twice there. I want to ask you that because when you said you raised the issue of whether, you know, if you're enjoying an advantage and you're, say, Patrick or Paxton, let alone anybody further down, why would you even run an ad? You know, a lot of people are going to interpret the fact that they are running those ads as a sign that they are worried. What do you think?
It's a good question. I think it's, you know, we have a theory in political science called mini-max regret. Yeah, Josh is
mini-max regret is great for parenting. Also,
yes,
continue.
Yeah, so it's a theory about strategic behavior, political context. We love it in voting because the idea is that what you're trying to do is to minimize the possibility of your maximum regret. Right. So, it's for those of you who are nerds like us, it's in contrast to, you know, ideas that people are strategic optimizers, right? They're trying to maximize their benefit. This one says, they're just trying to minimize the possibilities of the worst case scenario.
There's a campaign expenditure that you can maximize on the curve, and that'll be the right amount, but that's not what we're talking about here.
And I think what you probably have, Jim, is a case of mini-max reasoning, which is like, okay, what's our worst regret? Well, that we underachieve meaning the worst case would be you lose, but even that you underperform the other Republicans on the ballot by 3 or 4 or 5 points,
Right.
which makes you look terrible, and right
Among your friends.
right, exactly.
So-
or fundraise, or people who
Yeah.
have
Yeah, I get you.
aspirations for
Yeah.
higher office, right? So you spend the money. And the other possibility is that you actually have some sort of internal polling that shows you've got weaknesses, and here's the key, and you assume the other side is going to be able to take those concerns to the public. That last part of it is the one that I don't really understand. I just don't think, unless somebody's saving a lot of money for a spot during a Cowboys game in a week and a half.
After early voting's already been going on for a week.
Right. I'm just not seeing it from the Democrats. And I think to Josh's point about whether this is an indictment or not, where Democratic money is, where Democratic communication is, I'm at a loss to explain the silence from the left.
Yeah, I think on that, my hypothesis has been pretty much that I think that they adopted a minimax regret position after 2018. That basically after 2018, when some same Republicans had what was for them a near-death experience,
right.
that has influenced. There's I think there's a trope among Republicans in Texas that we're fine, but we can't be too complacent. Right. And that it's based on that kind of logic, I think. All right. So like a little bit of time we have left, let's talk about the issue environment a little bit. It seems to me overall that what we saw when we asked voters what issues were most important to their vote, and in conjunction with our usual MIP item, this is continuing to move in ways that were consistent with what we saw among the larger RV pool in August.
Yeah.
More or less.
Yeah, I think that's right. What you're seeing here is, in addition to sort of, when you look at the gap overall, which is sort of the touching off point here, across all the races, what I think we're seeing here in a lot of ways is sort of the accrual of Republican advantages sort of across the board. We're talking about a number of the statewide advantages now, but ultimately, I think the thing, that is really kind of, for better or worse, broken Republicans' way in the last few months of this campaign is that the economy's become front and center again. People are, when we look in the poll at economic evaluations, they had ticked slightly more positively or slightly less negatively, depending on how you want to look at it, in August from June. And then as we move ahead here to October, they've ticked back up in that negative direction again. And the salience of the issues of the economy and the border in particular have just continued to sort of stay front and center for too many voters in a lot of ways when you have a Democrat in the White House and Democrats in control of Congress. And when you look at our evaluations of Biden among registered voters, among likely voters, especially on these two key issues, the environment, the economic environment. So, the economy and inflation, and then the border, they're in the tank. They're terrible. They're terrible among independents. They're okay at best among Democrats. And so, for O'Rourke and company, the goal was to say, no, let's talk about the grid, let's talk about Uvalde, let's talk about abortion, let's talk about the local policy, the state policy environment, and make this
the stewardship critique.
The stewardship critique. The summer gave a little bit of a reprieve because you couldn't not look at those things. I don't think anybody had a choice whether that was what you were interested or not. But as we've come out of that into the fall now, and these other two issues are taking over, I think you see this in Abbott's messaging. They've sort of flipped to more focusing back on, let's make sure we're keeping Texas better than the United States. Let's make sure we're, sending a message to Joe Biden, let's make sure
about the border,
about the economy. And so, that message seems to be winning out, which is, not surprising in an increasingly nationalized environment, right?
Yeah, Josh, what was Biden's approval number? Is 39%?
I have to go back and
look. But let's say it's 38%, which I think is pretty much where it is. There's some interesting analyses lately that talk about the Democratic candidates' statewide races, so Senate elections and gubernatorial elections, ability to outpace the president's approval rating. And essentially the idea is that there's an upper boundary of about 5 or 6%. That if you're running 5 or 6% above what the president's getting in approval, that's about as good as you can do. And so O'Rourke's, clocking in at 43%. He's running if those numbers are right.
39 was what total approved.
39. So he's at 4. So he's 4 points better than Biden. So he's at the upper end of what you could expect a Democrat to do in this particular environment. And I take those analyses seriously. I think they're pretty instructive, and I think they're probably not great news for Warnock in Georgia and Fetterman in Pennsylvania and some other places. But just to reiterate what Josh is saying, I mean, the statewide issues, 33% said border security, immigration is their top issue. 16% said inflation or the economy. Right, so combine those, it's basically 50%. Yeah. On the other hand, abortion 6%, and even there, if you look at the candidate ratings, so people think who's better to handle the economy, inflation, Abbott or O'Rourke? Abbott's plus 11. On border security, Abbott's plus 12. On abortion, O'Rourke is up 4, and on guns or gun violence, they're even. So, and this is something I think we talked about earlier, which is the best the Democrat, and I think this is true nationally, the best the Democrats have been able to do is change the channel. Boy, there's an old guy metaphor.
Very good.
Change the channel for at least a few minutes.
Dial.
Yeah, with the remote thingy, to issues where they're not dominating. They're just sort of slightly, they're sort of competitive, maybe even have a very slight advantage, which is a heck of a lot better than running on issues where you're just getting decimated. And right now, the economy and immigration, the Democrats just aren't competitive.
Well, they don't have, and the thing is, here in Texas in particular, they don't have a message. I would just, now we're getting to the critical phase of the podcast. First, if you look at the data, just real quick before we do that, we look at the RV pool in August on the issues and who they trust more, and then we look broadly kind of across the board at the LV pool in October on the issues. And, when we go into this, we'd say it's a slightly more engaged group of people. So I think the don't knows drop off or either. O'Rourke about across all issues gains about a point, maybe 2 points, and Abbott gains about 5.
Yeah.
5 or 6. And then to draw this out a little further, just, I think part of this is to say, if your biggest concern is the economy or the border, and I think as I'm sitting here thinking about this, and I had a conversation with a Democratic friend over the weekend about this a little bit, what's the O'Rourke plan?
Yeah.
And I think if those are the most important issues, it's kind of hard to change the subject to something completely different, which I think they're finding. And so, why wouldn't you maintain the status quo at this point? Because at least with Abbott, property taxes they're going to try to cut property taxes, right? And we're going to see a muscular Texas approach to the border. Yeah. That's an answer. Even if you don't agree with it, know what it is.
The one interesting thing, let's throw a little bit of shade at the Republicans for once in this. It's been kind of tough, I'm sure, for Democratic listeners. But
I can do it at the end.
Yeah, well,
I can do it at the end.
Abbott and O'Rourke are basically even on property taxes as a issue handling thing, which surprised me a little bit, but then again, not so much.
Well, it's funny. I was on a panel at the Texas Taxpayers Association, which has been one of the people that are very focused on this. And I mentioned there was a discussion on the panel and in the room about the agenda next time and what property taxes would look like. And I did say, Paul Betancourt was in the building but not in the room at the time, that, as much as Republicans have talked and tried to do things about property taxes, the delivery has been not very well received, put it this way, very skeptically received among voters per our polling, and that expectations are not high that they're going to do much. The property tax thing is a really interesting example. I think that, to the point of how familiar this looks and the kind of, and last week when we were talking about this, Josh, I think we were talking about the last poll, and it's even more so this poll, that, for all the things that have happened, for all the changes we've seen in politics in the last few years, as unstable as it, blah, 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 you look at these the issue salience in your vote, and it's a very familiar story. You've got 60% of Republicans saying immigration and border security, another 18 saying the economy. Just take that immigration and border security number at 60%. The Democrats' top 3 choices, abortion, gun violence, environment, climate change, don't add up to 60%.
Right.
Classic Democratic problem in terms of, how you craft your message, what the argument's going to be, how you're going to motivate voters if you're thinking about it, not just in terms of partisanship, but through the template of issues.
There was an interesting article last week by 3 or 4 Democratic pollsters, Celinda Lake, Stan Greenberg, I think a couple others were authors of this. And it was sort of interesting spin at the top end, which is like, we are well positioned to achieve a historic victory, which I thought was, okay, I need to move to paragraph 2 at this point. But paragraph 2 was...
Well, maybe paragraph 4.
Yeah. Was an effort to identify and articulate a democratic economic message. And it was essentially, look at all these fat cat corporations and businesses that have made money off the pandemic and supply chain issues and stuff like that, which I think is probably the best you can do under these circumstances. And certainly these sort of populist messages do well, but that's been utterly absent from kind of democratic rhetoric in Texas. And I don't even know how well it would play this time around in Texas. I'm a little skeptical it would do as well as it does nationally. But to Josh's point, at least it's a message.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this just, this speaks to the political just, dumpster fire that inflation is, right? Because, I mean, the parties aren't practiced. I mean, especially if you're the party in power, what are you going to say? Because it's not that people don't have jobs, right? That's not the issue at this point. The issue is that every time they go and spend their money, they're mad.
Yeah.
And that's not something you can fix overnight. That's not something that infrastructure is going to fix. That's not something that you can just kind of turn the spigot on.
I think this is a really good point, which is neither party, and the Democrats, this is more an acute problem for the Democrats because they are the party in power.
Right.
But typically when Democrats get into power, they pass a lot of programs that spend money. And when people say, like, well, the economy is the real issue, they can point to those things and say, well, see, we spent money and that generates jobs. And see, so we're doing something to address those economic concerns you have. Yeah. And Republicans cut taxes and do the same thing. Well, inflation's a different animal. And it's tough to say, well, what's your economic plan? Well, we spent a lot of money.
Yeah.
And people go, well, wait a sec.
Well, and
then, very smart economists tell us how stupid we are for not seeing that these are totally unrelated, which I'm still sort of mystified about. But
Speaker Pelosi was on the morning shows trying to manage that critique in at least an appearance that I saw over the weekend, and they're not managing the answer. And look, it's a hard one. And I was going to say
it is for both sides. I just think it's just the Democrats own the keys to the car right now, and so the logical problem is theirs rather than Republicans explaining how tax cuts are going to help inflation.
And I think and it's interesting to see where that national environment is meeting the kind of organic state environment that we've been talking about. And there was maybe a brief period in the late spring and summer where it looked like that might not meet in the right way for Republicans here. Right. And I think this poll illustrates how much we're past that. So last 5 minutes, Daron's got to go. He's got an important appointment. I don't know what it is, but I just assume it's
everything
polling.
Darren does is important.
Yeah, it's another polling appointment.
Well, yes. So let's do a quick round about what really interested you in the poll, Daron.
I'll start with a number.
Something we haven't gotten at.
Yeah. We asked a series of questions about concerns about the actual functioning of the election. Apropos after 2020 and the problems we had with that election. We asked people about a series of election concerns, including people who are not eligible voting, people who are eligible not being allowed to vote, so voter fraud, voter suppression, all these things. And the item that far and away scored the highest, and highest here meaning the people expressed the most concern, identified it as potentially the most serious problem, was the spread of misinformation on social media. We had 51% who said it was an extremely serious problem. I think extremely or very serious problem.
Extremely, yeah.
Right. And it blows everything else away. The next highest scores for extremely serious are in the mid to high 30s. Right. I found that really fascinating. With all the talk, Republicans focusing on voter fraud, Democrats focusing on voter suppression. But if you ask people, now, of course, there's a partisan divide, which is Democrats think Republicans are falling for this misinformation. Republicans think Democrats are. But I still think the point is
voila, bipartisanship.
Right, exactly.
That's what it looks like now, guys.
Yeah, but there seems to be common ground in today's polarized America that social media is a real problem, or information through social media. So that caught my eye.
How about you, Josh?
We did a little bit of issue stuff. In addition to sort of figuring out, the candidate kind of issue ownership stuff that we talked about here. And just at the end, just so we could have a little sense of direction on some of this stuff. And it's hard for me, not to think about what the interpretation of this election is going to be, in the sense that let's just say, what we're talking about now is, Republicans are probably going to win at the top of the ticket, probably going to, almost, I'll say this right now, 100% sure they're going to have a majority in the Texas legislature and the House and the Senate. And so then, it's hard, like a lot of people, not, at least in the people who listen to this, not to already be looking ahead to the 2023 session. And I think it's going to be interesting is, how is this election interpreted? I mean, Jim brought up, how the 2018 election was interpreted as sort of as a very close shave. And then the next session was very much, let's focus on some of the bread and butter issues. Let's focus on public ed finance and property taxes. And then, going to obviously the last session was very conservative. And what I'm wondering is what the next session is going to look like in light of what we see in some of these policy numbers. So, for example, on gun control laws, 55% of Texas registered voters said that they wanted to see gun control laws made more strict than they are now. This is the highest share that have ever said this in the poll going back to 2015. On abortion, 50% of voters say they'd like to see the abortion laws in Texas made less strict. This is, again, by far the highest going back to 2013 when we started asking this question. So again, obviously, and this is to where we started in some ways, to those who would say like, well, you're not capturing, people who are, ginned up about abortion, or you're not, well, yeah, but you look at these numbers and it's in there. The policy response is in there. It's not making it through to the electorate. It's not making it through in the sense of in any way that's not reinforcing, I think, the views that people already have. But going to the next step, I'm curious to see what are people saying about what happens after the election and what that means for the session and policy in the state. I'm already over the election, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be that how that goes is an interesting question. I think for my thing, I was sort of noticing that I wanted to flag the election battery that Daron flagged simply because we're starting early voting today. And if you take the extremely serious and the somewhat serious responses in all of that problem, more than half are, expecting problems across the board, right? So as early voting starts, we are going to see attention paid to things happening in the election. The degree to which there are problems or not remains to be seen, but I think it's fair to expect there to be some problems in some places as we see first-time implementation of the new voting laws that were passed in 2021, and I think what this tells me is that there are a lot of voters that are ready for this. I mean, people are primed, and I think that's going to be really interesting. Since Daron sort of hit on my thing, I'm going to add one more thing before we get out, and that's just to circle back to something we talked about earlier in terms of what is, what is on the electorate's mind. We talked about the legal problems of Attorney General Paxton. We talked about the prevalence of immigration and the psyche of a lot of voters. We have this battery that sometimes we use and sometimes we don't. It's kind of like a heat check where we ask people, how much have you heard about these things that have been in the news to some degree? The share of people that said that they had heard a lot about the legal problems of Attorney General Paxton was 20%. The share that said they had heard a lot about the number of migrants attempting to cross the U.S.-Mexico border was more than 50%. Mm-hmm. So, the environment that's out there is really helping to reinforce these things. So with Daron about to go, I want to thank Daron for taking the time to be here, Josh for all the work you did on the poll, of course, and for being here today. To our excellent production team of the Dev Studio and the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin, and to our listeners, thank you for listening. Remember, you can find all the data that we referenced today, much, much more, including our poll tracker of other polls. There's 2 or 3 polls released in the last 24 hours, I think, and much more at the Texas Politics Project website. That's texaspolitics.utexas.edu. So thanks again for listening. We'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.